I was walking through the park last Tuesday, just after the rain stopped. Everything had that sharp, clean smell. I saw this woman, probably in her 60s, standing perfectly still by the fountain. She was staring intently at an empty bench, and she was listening. You could tell. She'd nod, her expression would soften, and then she'd smile, just slightly, as if hearing a private, wonderful secret. She wasn't bothering anyone. She seemed, if anything, entirely at peace. But as people passed, you saw that familiar, almost rehearsed reaction. The quick glance, the slight widening of the eyes, and then the very deliberate, very firm act of looking away. It was a silent, collective vote. In that instant, everyone who walked by, myself included, participated in an unspoken agreement. We all agreed on a shared reality. And in that reality, the woman was broken, she was delusional, she was wrong. But that moment stuck with me. The sheer certainty of our consensus and the absolute calmness of her divergence. It forces you to ask, what exactly is that consensus built on? And what happens when you realize it's just as fragile as the reality she was experiencing on that bench? That interaction, that silent collective judgment, is really the starting point for this deep dive. We're tackling the structure that holds our daily lives together, what creates our consensual reality.
Right. What happens when it fractures, on an individual level? And maybe most importantly, the surprisingly high social and biological cost of deviating from that collective agreement.
It's a dive into the unspoken rules of civilization, really, the invisible structure.
Exactly.
And you realize pretty quickly that society isn't just maintained by, armies or governments. It's held together by a shared belief system, a fundamental agreement that most of what we accept as fact isn't governed by the laws of nature, but, by human consensus.
And that idea that we collectively build and maintain reality, it has a formal academic structure, right? We're talking about the social construction of reality, or SCR.
Popularized by sociologists Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman.
And their whole idea is that concepts we treat as solid and absolute. Things like money, gender, even the concept of a weekend.
Yeah.
They aren't natural laws, they're artifacts built on human-made agreements. It sounds abstract, I know, but it's deeply practical. Humans are biologically incomplete. We don't have these hardwired instincts for building complex, large-scale societies.
So we have to invent the rules.
We have to invent the rules and structures to avoid chaos. And that necessity leads to this continuous cyclical process where our actions define society, and then in turn, society defines us.
Okay, so let's walk through those 3 steps because they explain exactly how a simple idea becomes an objective truth. Step 1 is externalization.
Externalization. This is where we as individuals pour out our ideas, our habits, our cultural practices.
Okay, like what?
Think of something really simple. How do you behave in an elevator?
You turn around, face the door, don't make eye contact.
Right. And that's not a law of physics. It's a spontaneous human invention designed to manage awkward proximity. It's a necessary structure we externalized to make the elevator function socially.
And if everyone starts doing that, in New York, in London, in Tokyo, that routine quickly moves to the next step. It starts to harden.
Exactly. That's objectivation.
Yeah.
These routines and cultural products, they harden into stable, widely shared institutions.
And they get this feeling of being real.
They acquire what's called objective facticity. They feel undeniable, external, as if they exist independently of our will. The best example is always money. A $20 bill is just cotton and ink.
But it has power.
It possesses objective facticity. Why? Because we all collectively agree that it holds a specific value, and that value feels as inevitable as the tide.
I always find that part so unsettling. The banking system, copyright law, these are human inventions that feel just as fixed as the speed of light.
They do. And that stability is necessary for life to function, but it creates the third and final step. Internalization.
This is where the next generation comes in.
Yes. This is where new members, children, immigrants, even new employees, they absorb this objective reality through socialization. They don't question the school system or the value of the dollar. They accept these objectivated rules as just, unquestionable truths that fundamentally shape their identity.
And that brings up the key danger in the whole cycle, right? Reification.
The great sociological sin.
Forgetting that we made the rules.
It's the ultimate intellectual error in this framework. Reification means treating our own human creations, gender roles, national boundaries, bureaucratic processes, as if they were immutable natural forces acting upon us.
Like when someone says, well, that's just the market.
You can't change that. It's just how the system works.
Yeah.
That's reification. You've given the construct power over yourself.
So we've basically shifted from studying what is an eternal philosophical truth to studying truth as a social product.
Mm-hmm.
Truth is simply what has been successfully externalized, objectivated, and then legitimated for the next generation to internalize.
Precisely. We stop seeing the man behind the curtain. We become subject to our own mental architecture.
So if the stability of society depends on this collective agreement, what happens when that agreement fails on the smallest possible scale inside a single person's mind? What happens when their subjective reality peels away from the consensus?
Well, that leads us out of sociology and, right into the philosophy of mind. We have to confront the problem of the subjective character of experience.
Right.
And there's a great thought experiment for this by the philosopher Thomas Nagel, his famous paper, What is it like to be a bat?
That sounds delightfully weird.
It is. And Nagel argues that every subjective experience is tied to a unique point of view, an ego that no other organism can fully gather experience from.
Okay.
A bat experiences the world through echolocation. We can study the physics of sound, we can study bat anatomy all day long, but we can never truly know what it is like for the bat to process the world that way.
The raw, felt, subjective experience.
It's fundamentally closed off.
So every single one of us is living behind our own highly specific perspective filter, which means there's an ultimate philosophical boundary to our personal reality no matter what the consensus is outside.
And that boundary is reinforced by our biology. Cognitive science has shown that the mind is essentially a prediction engine.
It's always guessing.
Constantly. It's taking in this massive amount of sensory input and trying to find patterns, continuity. Our brains crave coherence, anticipating what's next, so we can react quickly. We don't perceive reality passively, we actively construct it.
Based on our expectations.
Yes. And if the mechanism for constructing that prediction gets corrupted, that's when the individual reality splinters.
And that's where we get into conditions like schizophrenia.
Yes. The sources suggest it's not necessarily a simple failure of perception, but a profound deviation in how the brain interprets, organizes, and synthesizes that flood of incoming information.
And that's tied to dopamine.
The neurobiological mechanism is often tied to dysregulated dopamine pathways.
Help us understand that connection. We usually hear about dopamine with, pleasure or motivation.
Think of dopamine in this context as the salience signal.
Salience. So what's important?
Exactly. Tells the brain, pay attention. This input matters. This means something. If your dopamine system is dysregulated, too high, too sensitive, you start assigning profound, often personalized, meaning to random, ambiguous stimuli.
So if a curtain billows in the wind, a regulated brain just says, that's air movement.
Right.
But a dysregulated brain says, that's a sign, that's a message specifically for me.
Precisely. The brain starts constructing these elaborate meanings from anomalies instead of just discarding them as noise.
Wow.
So the individual is forced to live in a reality where the patterns are vivid, undeniable, and deeply meaningful, but onto which no one else is co-signed. They are trapped.
Trapped in a subjective world that feels objectively real to them, but is completely rejected by the external consensus.
It's the ultimate isolation.
And that ties back to the existential crisis inherent in madness, right? I mean, philosophers like John Locke argued centuries ago that the continuity of memory and personal perception is the only true marker of existence. If the coherence of your subjective world fails, the integrity of your self-awareness is challenged.
That's the cognitive void. If the thread of your subjective experience, the continuous self snaps, existence itself becomes mutable.
And that's terrifying.
That is why madness is so fundamentally feared socially. It reveals that reason and reality, which we assume are fixed and external, are in fact highly dependent on a functioning, coherent biological machine.
It exposes our own foundation as being far less stable than we prefer to believe. So, if consensus is the currency of society, what is the price of dissent?
We look at some really fascinating social psychological research on this.
We did.
It quantified the social and even the physical cost of challenging the collective agreement.
Yeah, think about that scientist who challenges the prevailing model or the whistleblower. They are challenging objective facticity.
So this study simulated that.
It did. It looked at intergroup conflict, simulating a devil's advocate scenario to measure the physiological and psychological fallout of dissent. Okay, so they had two groups. The agents of dissent, the person told to argue against the group's idea, and the targets of dissent, the people whose ideas were rejected. Let's focus on the biological findings first, because this is where the cost gets physical.
It really does. The targets of dissent, the people whose consensus was rejected, showed a measurable stress response. Specifically, they exhibited what are called avoidance-motivated responses.
Avoidance-motivated, so their body wants to get away.
Their cardiovascular system showed vasoconstriction.
The narrowing of blood vessels.
Yes. This is the physiological profile associated with threat appraisal. The body is anticipating harm and preparing to withdraw or flee.
So being told your ideas are wrong or being rejected by the group registers in the body not just as an insult, but as a genuine physical danger.
Absolutely. The body feels threatened by social exclusion because evolutionarily, social exclusion used to mean death.
Okay, so what about the other side, the person doing the arguing?
Now, compare that to the agents of dissent. They exhibited an approach-motivated cardiovascular profile.
Meaning they were physiologically ready to engage.
Yes, they had lower vascular resistance, greater sympathetic nervous system activation. It suggests their systems felt they had the necessary resources to meet the challenge and influence the outcome.
They were actively doing something, not being done to.
That's the key difference.
That's a profound difference in internal experience. One group feels physiologically threatened, the other feels physiologically mobilized.
And the psychological findings confirm this split,
Yeah.
especially when you measure it against fundamental psychological needs.
Those being belonging, self-esteem, control, and meaningful existence.
For the targets of dissent, the psychological damage was extensive. They experienced threats to all four of those needs.
All four.
Their self-esteem was questioned, their sense of belonging decreased, they lost control over the group's decision, and their contribution was rendered meaningless. They felt entirely devalued and adrift.
But the people doing the challenging, the agents of dissent, had a different experience.
They did. I mean, they experienced the social threats, their belonging and self-esteem took a hit, because being confrontational isn't fun for anyone.
Right.
But critically, their needs for control and meaningful existence were met. They derived satisfaction from actively shaping the group's final outcome, even if it meant being temporarily unpopular.
Yeah.
They're exercising influence.
That summarizes the cost so beautifully. Being the target of negative social feedback, of group rejection, comes with profound, measurable costs, from impaired decision-making to potentially higher long-term health risks.
Associated with chronic stress.
So the consensus, our shared reality, is enforced not just through social shaming, but through a genuine biological threat response levied against the individual who deviates.
When you put it all together, the takeaway here is that the creation of reality starts with human invention externalization. It hardens into unquestionable fact objectivation, and then it's internalized by us as individuals.
And when we challenge it,
The system fights back. And that fight is felt not just in our minds or emotions, but in our physical circulatory systems. We are biologically wired to fear social rejection because social cohesion is the glue of reality itself.
the stability of our social world, whether we are talking about the integrity of a nation, the definition of contract, or even just the value of a piece of paper, depends entirely on this collective agreement. It is an agreement that is not ultimately secured by objective facts outside of human existence, but by the relentless social and biological effort required to keep us all looking at the same map.
That's it.
The true fragility of reality lies not in the philosophical concept, but in the constant social and biological effort required to prevent us from noticing how close we are to creating an entirely different one.